You can count when you're happy. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can count when you're sad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or count when you're frightened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Count when you're mad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting is wonderful. Counting is marvelous. Counting's terrific and how.
Bob Rickman and Kyle Tippet used to be business partners, salesmen who were in a car together during the meteor shower. Now, thanks to the always ironic fate of the Smallville universe, they both have the crypto power of persuasion. Tippet lives in the woods, Smallville's local misunderstood crackpot hermit who, hang on, I'm spinning the wheel of recluse cliches, makes ugly sculptures. Oh, and there's a rumor that the Wachowski brothers live behind him. No, I'm kidding. Tippet lives on his own, afraid to use his gift because he doesn't want to turn into the manipulative and greedy Bob Rickman, his natural opposite, who's been using his power of persuasion for 9 years to grow his company, which builds power plants and talks people out of their homes and their businesses. He also uses it to break as many rules as he can get away with, building a reputation for being really good at talking anyone into anything and confusing people as to how he manages to horribly pollute communities and stay in business, much less get arrested. We see from the opening scene that whenever anyone gets in his way, he just talks them into suicide. So now, despite the deal he made with Kyle to stay out of Smallville, Bob's back. He says in the teaser that he wants to open a plant in Smallville because it has a warm, fuzzy place in his heart. And while he lies about everything else, there's no other good explanation as to why he chose this moment as opposed to any other to show up there. So I can't help but wonder if he really is both an evil and corrupt tycoon and a nostalgic romantic. Naturally, the best place to build a plant is right on the Kent farm. It's right outside of town, good and out of the way, no residential anywhere near it. Oh. Rickman gets Jonathan to sign the farm away, and meanwhile six various people on Kyle, hoping to kill him since he's the only person on the planet who knows about Bob's powers. Lana and Whitney think Kyle is dangerous, because something spooked Lana's horse toward the beginning of the episode, and they got Kyle on videotape leaning over it. And of course, this happens just as Kyle's old partner, who he hasn't seen in almost a decade, shows up in Smallville. Ah, the convenience bug is bitten again. Whitney and Lana both become furious with Clark for not buying into stereotypical assumptions about the Hermit, as they assume he must be responsible solely on his unverified reputation. Clark, being the horrible, uncaring friend to Lana that he is, decides to actually investigate, and goes to see Kyle himself. And then he concludes in a surprisingly objective way that his character is not that of a lunatic, and that there's more to him than anyone realizes. Rickman persuades Whitney to attack Kyle, and after Clark steps in to keep either from getting hurt, Whitney tells the police that Kyle attacked him, and Kyle's put in jail, later using his power to escape, only to be attacked again, this time by a cop Rickman brainwashes. Lex puts Kyle up and gets him medical attention, escapes again, but finally, after Clark confronts him one last time, agrees to help stop Rickman by revealing what he knows to the public. Rickman brainwashes Lex next, who tries to kill Clark and Tippet, and Clark and Lex play The Matrix. And perhaps the reclusive Wachowski brothers directed this scene. Though obviously Lex does a better impersonation of Agent Smith than Clark does of Neo, as Clark seems to think the goal is to collect the bullets rather than dodge them. Clark snaps Lex out of it after finally figuring out that he's bulletproof. Lana magically decides, now that the episode is nearly over, to let bygones be bygones, and Clark talks with Lex, foreshadowing their eventual and inevitable rivalry, paralleled of course by Tippet and Rickman's. Then credits. We're in the middle of a stretch of episodes trying very admirably to not get stuck in a rut of generic Kryptofreaks. Now we're back to something we've seen only in Hourglass so far. 2 Kryptofreaks in one episode. Except this time, they have history together, and they share the same power. It's admittedly pretty contrived to have the meteor shower give 2 people right next to each other the same power, especially when we're not told if the kryptonite mixed with anything in particular to create this phenomenon. And it seems, once again, that kryptonite has a sense of humor. It gives both these guys persuasion powers because persuasion is precisely what they were lacking to be successful in their sales jobs. Given the glowing kryptonite that seemed to be eagerly awaiting Sean and Cool, it's probably for the best that we didn't actually witness their transformation. I'm picturing a pair of meteor rocks hanging out in the back of the trunk of their car, snickering like gremlins. But I like that, for really only the second time so far, we have a Kryptofreak who doesn't have to be the antagonist. Regardless of plausibility, it makes for a fresh dynamic, and the episode delightfully explores the parallel between Bob and Kyle's deteriorated friendship due to Bob's corruption, and the inevitable similar road we know Clark and Lex's pairing must eventually take. Until the final scene, which does spell this out, it's done subtly enough. Two friends who both become powerful. One chooses to use his powers for fortune and greed, while the other refuses to take that road. Now they're bitter enemies. Kyle is the only thing that stands in Bob's way, and Bob's only recourse is to kill his old friend. I like that this isn't a direct parallel to Clark and Lex, as the mythos of the Warrior Angel comic will be later on in Stray, but is a relationship for Clark to learn from. Kyle is afraid to use his powers because he doesn't want to become like Bob. So while Bob's been destroying communities, he's just decided it's not his problem. But Clark, with his upbringing and with what he's been through so far, has a clear, well-considered opinion on this. He says, when you have a gift, you can't just hide in a hole and hope it goes away. That's synonymous, of course, with the Spider-Man tagline of, with great power comes great responsibility. Bob and Kyle seem like opposite extremes. But you throw Clark in the mix, and you see that Kyle is another possible future for Superman, a version where Clark is terrified of his powers and doesn't trust himself not to let them corrupt him, as Lex's worldly power corrupts him. I like seeing Clark face that here. He sees what that decision does to Kyle, and the guilt he has for the people he's let Bob hurt. In the end, Clark has convinced Kyle to move on and use his gift to help people. While all this is good for Clark's character building, in Kyle's case, Kyle does have a point. Sure, he has a responsibility to stop Bob, being the only person who knows what he can do and with the means to put an end to it. But beyond that, his powers are a little different than Clark's. There's nothing inherently amoral about running fast or having super strength. And the one power he has that's an invasion of privacy, X-ray vision, is one to be used discreetly, but certainly has its appropriate applications. I doubt if anyone's going to have a problem with being spied on if they're, buried alive. But Kyle Tippet can make anyone do whatever he wants. Any way you slice it, he's messing with somebody's free will whenever he uses that power. Now, I personally would probably advocate using a power like that to, say, persuade someone to stop robbing a bank or attacking someone in a back alley. But I could also see the argument that the nature of the power itself is inherently morally questionable. The same has been said about telepathy, which is why I think stories have been written about Professor X where he'll do the morally reprehensible thing for the greater good. The Yulians, in the Star Trek The Next Generation episode Violations, wouldn't read anyone's mind without their permission, and the violation referred to by the episode title was a misuse of that power to elicit a telepathic sexual experience with Deanna Troi. But you can't exactly ask permission to make a bad guy change his mind. So while I agree with Clark that Kyle had a responsibility in stopping Bob, I don't entirely agree with this blanket statement he makes. Not every gift is the same, and in Kyle's case, I think I'd be real selective about when and how I used it. Like the theme of manipulation of power in Rogue, here we're exploring persuasion and how it can be used to gain power. It's actually a similar idea and a pretty appropriate place to put it after Clark's recent dealings with Sam Phelan, after he briefly considered not using his gifts at all at the end of that episode, as Kyle is doing here, afraid of his family getting hurt again. He realizes that's always going to be a risk. But it would be worse to be in a situation he could have made better and sacrificed the lives of those in need over those he cares about who might be hurt. Dare I say, Clark seems to be already growing as a character here, and people wonder why the first season is my favorite. This easily could have been another episode that focused too much on the guest stars, but it rightly uses their story to tell us something about our characters. Not knowing that Bob is aided by a superpower, Lex tells Clark that what Bob is doing is just good business, and this is coming from someone who despises Rickman for polluting the communities he enters and doesn't want him in Smallville. And Lex unknowingly describes the very philosophy that leads him down a dark road when he says, the key to leadership is not only knowing you're right, but convincing everyone else. If you can do that, the world is your oyster. That's true, but like a dangerous invention in the wrong hands, it turns into a supervillain motto, twisted into something more like, the key to power is convincing everyone you're doing the right thing, even when it's the wrong thing. So Bob Rickman isn't just a foil for Lex. By seeing how Lex responds to the man, someone he doesn't admire but understands and has probably more in common with than he'd like to admit, we find that maybe we know something about Lex that he himself hasn't figured out yet, since we know he's destined for badness. I also dig the idea that doing the right thing isn't always inherently persuasive, especially when prejudice and assumption are involved. In an episode about people with the power of persuasion, Clark can't convince his friends of much of anything. He's interested in doing the right thing no matter who's involved, while Lana and Whitney, with no proof that Kyle had any ill intentions when he went over to her, want to blame him based solely on prior local suspicion. I'll get into Lana and Whitney's obnoxious motivations later, as I'm not real keen on how the writers decided Lana should handle herself this episode, but I do like Lex's allegory of Clark being like Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird. Again, as with Rogue, Clark is somebody we can identify with and look up to in this episode. He puts his personal friendship with Lana, not to mention any chance of a romance, on the line for the sake of objectivity. He won't assume someone's a bad person just because he seems odd and doesn't live the way Clark does. But Clark's also a little naive, as you'd expect for a freshman in high school, and he just thinks this kind of thinking is a given. He can't believe Lana and Whitney are acting the way they are, and when Lex tells him about To Kill a Mockingbird, Clark asks him how it ends. Lex responds with, "The ending isn't important, it's the journey that matters." If you know how that play ends, that moment is kind of funny, but it's also a great character moment for these two, as it's exactly that idea that will turn them into bitter enemies. Clark trying to do the right thing, and Lex hating him for it. As usual, the coolest parts are the Lex parts. I don't always like Smallville ironies, but I do really enjoy that the first time Clark gets shot and figures out he's bulletproof, it's by Lex. And more cool foreshadowing going on. Lex helps Clark harbor Kyle when he breaks out of jail because he's been shot by the cop Bob sent after him. And Lex calls in an underground doctor who isn't supposed to be practicing medicine. This is the second time the Club Zero incident has been brought up. The other was with Sam Phelan. Phelan got Lex out of the press, and this guy sewed up his knife wound. These were so subtle, I never realized they were related until after I saw Zero, and then rewatched the season. Very slick bit of continuity. The final scene, where Clark asks if what happened to Bob and Rick will ever happen to them, is one of the more memorable exchanges from the series. Lex's line is great. "Trust me, Clark, our friendship is going to be the stuff of legend." Lex made all the best points about the nature of persuasion and power in this episode, and yet he has no idea how similar of a path he's on to Rickman's. Okay, Lana seems to exist in the show for three purposes. A, to be a target for Kryptofreaks. B, to be the subject of love triangles. And C, to play whatever role needs to be filled in a story that can't be done by a guest star. Sometimes that means she has a surprising amount of common sense and kind-heartedness, as we saw in Rogue. Here, she's back to playing the obnoxiously irrational position as she gets angry with Clark for not siding with Whitney against Kyle Tippet just because he's Whitney. Now here's what they know. Lana was spooked and fell off her horse. Kyle was there. Whitney later showed up at Kyle's house, and Kyle says he attacked without provocation. Here are the extra ingredients Lana is adding to the concoction. Whitney is her boyfriend and is therefore more trustworthy than Kyle. Whitney is going through a difficult ordeal with his sick father, which apparently also somehow makes him more trustworthy than Kyle. Clark still remembers that Whitney strung him up in a field, therefore Clark is siding against Whitney. Her exact words are, "You're just looking for an excuse to knock Whitney." Here's what I know. If I were strung up in a field by a guy who's ticked off just because I talked to his girlfriend, and he's sadistic enough to even think of putting her necklace around my neck, and then later he only apologizes because he once said necklace back, that guy has to somehow prove that he's trustworthy to me. Now granted, some workers were spooked off their horses in the woods and Kyle got one of their helmets. We're never told what that's about, and it shouldn't have been left so ambiguous. But as Clark says, he's not taking anyone's side. It isn't that Kyle isn't suspicious at all, and Whitney is. It's that they both are, and it doesn't make sense that Whitney would attack the guy in the woods, or that he would attack Whitney for no reason. Things aren't adding up, and because Clark says that, Lana thinks he's siding against her boyfriend. The real question Clark should be asking himself isn't why the fight in the woods happened, it's why he's still so interested in Lana. Now you can make the argument that teenagers are irrational, especially under pressure. Okay, I'll give you that. But the episode doesn't seem to take the position that Lana and Whitney are really being impulsive and uncompromising, but more that everyone involved has a point, and they just don't. If Clark is completely in the right, and she's completely in the wrong, then she should apologize at the end for being so immature. She doesn't do that. Instead, she says, "I think our friendship is worth more than one argument." And this conversation happens not because anything was resolved. After all, she wouldn't really know what happened with Bob and Kyle in the end, but simply because the episode is nearly over. This is somewhat of a manufactured conflict. Again, I like the Clark versus the world angle, but I don't like despising Lana when the script clearly doesn't intend for that to be the audience's reaction. Nell doesn't even appear in this episode, but that doesn't mean that her evil doesn't still seep in off-screen. We're told from a phone conversation that after the incident with Lana's spooked horse, she wants Clark to lie to the police and say he saw Kyle spook the horse. I'm telling you, as manipulative as she is, she and Lionel Luthor could have been an item, and it would not have been the strangest thing on the show by a mile. Like with Phelan, the writing's a little sloppy in regards to how Bob gets away with stuff. I don't buy, even with his powers, that he can do things like cause suicides and more people than he could possibly handshake wouldn't get suspicious of him. We're told that with Jonathan's signature on the paper, it would take a team of lawyers to get him out of the deal he made with Rickman. But surely, if several people throughout his career had said, you know, I had no interest in selling and I don't even remember the moments between being handed a pen and signing with it, that should be suspicion enough to start a pretty major investigation. I just don't see Rickman shaking the hands of every single person that smelled foul play. Also, while I like the Kent's farm being on the line because it raises the stakes and makes it personal for our characters, I never really felt like they were in danger of losing it. With Lex right there from the beginning saying, I've got lawyers, everything's fine, I'm not really afraid for the Kents at any point. I don't like that Kyle doesn't warn Clark about how Bob's powers work. After Clark takes him back home and Clark asks what happened between the two of them, Kyle responds with, stay away from him. I don't know, I might have said something more like, whatever you do, don't shake his hand. I don't think hug is a real appropriate title. Handshake would have been more accurate, and if that sounds too dopey, maybe push, which is a good description of the persuasion power, especially considering the man who jumps to his own demise in the teaser. And now questions to ask Jarrell when I get to heaven. How exactly do Bob and Kyle's powers work? It's pretty inconsistent. Every person who's controlled by them has a complete lapse in memory from the moment they're affected to the moment it wears off. But not Whitney. He actually remembers what happened, but in a different way. Lex remembers nothing, Jonathan remembers nothing. So can these guys also persuade someone to remember events in a different way, like the flashy things in Men in Black? If so, that's information we, the audience, kind of need. And now let's jump over to the scoreboard. We've got two Kryptofreaks this week, Bob Rickman and Kyle Tippet, both with persuasion powers, and Bob's villain motivation is, I can have whatever I like. We've got a new category this week, characters who aren't themselves, and there's 5 of those. Paul in the teaser, the guy who commits suicide, Whitney when he goes after Tippet, Jonathan when he signs his life away, the girl who is watching Kyle and Lex's mansion, and Lex when he goes after Clark and Kyle. We've got one instance of a rude super speed exit. That's when Clark runs off to find Lana after he and Chloe hear her scream. We've got 3 instances of Clark in bullet time. One when he stands in front of Whitney and Kyle hits him with a baseball bat, then when he tries to deflect a bullet but it still hits him in the shoulder, and then when Lex shoots at him and he takes most of the bullets. I'm telling you, he really needs to study with Keanu Reeves. We've got one instance of somebody walking away from a conversation angry. That's when Lana gets mad at Clark for accusing Whitney of attacking Kyle, even though he didn't. And finally, we've got one instance of Clark and Lana in the loft, and that's when Lana comes to see if Clark's changed his opinion of Kyle, and of course, when he hasn't, she stays angry. I'm gonna give Hug a 3 out of 4. I made to like Clark again. I want to see him more like this in the way he was in Rogue all the time, but Lana's back to making no sense, and the Kryptofreak plot, while thematically interesting, is a little sloppy. Was there an item I missed in any category? Send me a personal message on Geekvolution on YouTube, and I'll be sure to add it to the count. I'm Captain Logan, and consider this episode counted.